To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if the bees are few. Welcome to Bees and Reverie Radio. This is a podcast about pollinator gardens, native plants, bees, butterflies, and other topics related to biodiversity, including what we can do in our own backyards and what we can do together to protect bees, butterflies, and habitat here in the United States. I'm LaDawna Howard, though you might know me best from social media as Donna Likes Plants. My co-host Emily is off this week, so it's just me. But if you're growing a pollinator garden or considering starting one this year, I think this episode may interest you. It's titled Adding Herbs to Your Pollinator Garden. Over the past few years, I've been transforming my own yard from just regular turf grass into a mostly native plant and pollinator habitat, but I also like to grow some food and herbs for myself for cooking. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about some plants that are commonly grown and used in the U.S. for cooking or flavoring food. So herbs like basil, chives, dill, parsley, thyme, those kind of plants, and whether or not some of those plants might be a good addition to a pollinator garden. In this episode, I'm going to cover a lot of these common herbs, and I'm going to sort of group them into categories based on how careful you may want to be with them, based on their native status and their ability to spread beyond your yard, in case that's a concern where you are. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I'll also share some growing tips so that whether you want to grow these herbs to eat or grow them for the pollinators or, like me, do both at the same time, this episode will help you get started. Even though I have a yard, I grow a lot of my herbs in containers on my patio, and I'm going to tell you why. One great thing about herbs is that most of them don't take up a lot of space or resources to grow. Most of them don't need much, if any, supplemental fertilization, and most of them are easy to grow from seed. So I hope this episode will help you decide whether it makes sense for you to grow these, and if so, which ones, and how to get started. A lot of herbs are the type of plant that if you like to grow food to eat yourself, herbs are a huge bang for the buck. Meaning many of these herbs are cheap and easy to grow, but kind of expensive or troublesome if you want to buy them from the store. Some of these can get pretty pricey for how much you get at the grocery store, and they don't always keep well. Once you bring them home, you got to use them up, really fast. I love being able to step outside into my own yard and just clip off the amount that I want to use to season my lunch or dinner or whatever. Also, I know mine are healthy because I know I didn't use any pesticides or herbicides or that type of thing in my yard. And they really are inexpensive to grow. Most of these herbs you can grow pretty easily from seed, and you can see some results usually in the first year. And so instead of buying, just one serving of fresh herbs at the store in one of those little plastic containers, in the refrigerator section that might be $4 or $5 or something for, a little tiny bit of herbs, you can take that money, buy a packet of seeds, and then depending on the size of the seeds they are, this may allow you to grow 25 or 50 or 100 or more plants for the cost of one packet of seeds, which, one packet of seeds might just cost $3 or $4. So, bang for the buck. And some herbs are perennial in parts of the United States, meaning that once you plant these, you can harvest and eat them in the first year, but they may also come back year after year from those same roots. So for the herbs on my list today, I'll tell you whether it's considered an annual or perennial, and sometimes I might mention which gardening zones a plant is considered perennial in. So if you don't know your gardening zone, you can find it out pretty easily online at a place like Farmer's Almanac or the USDA website, or you can just do a search online, what is my gardening zone, and find a lot of sites that allow you to plug in your zip code or look at a map or something like that. Sometimes you might hear it called gardening zone, like I've been saying the phrase gardening zone, but you might also hear it called a growing zone or a hardiness zone. Now, you usually won't hear Emily or I talking a lot about gardening zones in this podcast because gardening zones just tell us how cold it gets in the winter, and so it tells us whether a perennial plant is likely to survive the winter where you are, and that's pretty much it. Anytime we're putting something in our yard that is not native to the United States, it's good to know sort of where it falls on a spectrum from a native, really good plant to grow in that ecoregion up to, oh, is this plant invasive and a problem? And not only should we not plant it, but we should eradicate it. And a lot of plants, though, fall sort of somewhere in between. And that's where some of these non-native herbs fall. They're sort of somewhere in between. I'm not going to suggest any plants to you that are considered invasive anywhere in the United States, so you don't have to worry about that part of it. But some of these plants are in a designation where they're not native, they're not considered invasive, but some of them may be aggressive growers or may be able to self-sow, meaning that if you let these go to flower and then to seed, those seeds may be viable and be able to spread. So whether a plant is invasive can be sort of hard to determine, and sometimes it takes time to figure out that some plant that we are all putting into our yards or gardens has become invasive. So you do need to consider where you live, both in terms of like your ecoregion or whether your state may consider a plant a problem. But the other thing I would encourage you to think about is, where is your yard? Meaning, are you right in the middle of a suburb where you're not really close to a natural or native area? And so something that may be an aggressive grower in your own yard probably isn't going to get out into nature. On the other hand, do you live right up against a native area? Can you walk out your backyard and walk into a native woodland or prairie? In that case, you may want to be more careful and err more on the side of caution of not letting things like some of these herbs go to flower and go to seed, where their seeds might start spreading into that native area. So just consider where you live, consider your yard. So then you might wonder, well, why plant any of these herbs if they're not native? And the reason is, as I mentioned earlier, some of these are culinary herbs that we may like to eat from. So then you might be wondering, well, why go to the trouble with these herbs if they're not native? Maybe you just don't want to mess with them. And that's fine if you don't want to. But most of these non-native herbs will support pollinators, particularly generalists, with nectar and sometimes pollen from their flowers if you let them go to flower. And some of these herbs, like parsley and dill, can even be used as a host plant by some of our butterflies, like native swallowtail butterflies here in the United States. A host plant meaning they will lay their eggs and their caterpillars will grow and eat these plants. Another benefit to some of these cooking herbs in our garden, and this might sound a little bit contradictory at first because I've just talked about how if you let them go to flower, some of them can feed pollinators with nectar and pollen, and some of them can be host plants. Their leaves and stems can be host plants for butterflies. But on the other hand, herbs, because they have very aromatic leaves, meaning like if you brush up against these leaves or you crush them in your fingers, they have a strong smell. That's why we like to use them in our cooking. And so some of these can actually act as a preventative for some other insects that you might consider to be more of like a pest. And some of them can deter deer or rabbits or other little animals in your yard. And so some of these may be helpful, especially in your food garden, with allowing you to go completely pesticide, insecticide free. I'm going to start first with a set of herbs that are perennial in most of the United States, meaning that these plants, if you plant them from seed in the first year, they're going to come back year after year, which can be great, but these also happen to be very aggressive growers. So these you want to be careful about whether you put them in the ground, and if you do put them in the ground, where you put them. And these are oregano, thyme, and mint. And actually, let me just start from mint. Don't plant mint in the ground. Really, you don't want to plant mint in the ground. Mint is an incredibly aggressive grower. It spreads in a couple of ways. Number one, it spreads by runners underground. And in some species of mint, those runners can go for 4 feet or more. So it will spread out of the area where you put it. Number two, mint flowers easily, and it will flower a lot of the summer, which is beautiful, and pollinators love it. But if it goes to seed, mint can also spread itself by seed on the wind. I would even be careful about planting mint in a container. Mint is not the first one that I would choose to plant. So let's not talk anymore about mint. If you're not sure, just don't plant mint. Now let's talk about oregano and thyme. Neither of these are native in the United States. Now, they're not as aggressive of a grower as most mint species in the United States, but these do act like ground covers. They can spread really easily and really quickly over the ground. And they are perennial in most parts of the United States, meaning that once you plant them, they will come back year after year from their root systems. And depending on where you live, oregano can be a very aggressive grower that may rival mint in terms of how easily it will spread, so be careful with that. Now, all of that said, oregano and thyme are popular herbs that we like to cook with, and if you let them go to flower, the bees and the pollinators do like them. So if you've got the right conditions for them, do be careful about where you put them in the ground, and these may be two that you want to consider putting in containers. I want to turn now to a couple of herbs that are really commonly grown in gardens all around the United States, dill and parsley. These are both wonderful to cook with and to flavor things with. They're easy to grow from seed. These are not perennial, but they're also not annual. These are called a biennial plant, meaning that each plant lives for 2 or 3 years, depending on the conditions. Now, most people, though, grow these as an annual. So if you're talking to gardeners who are growing these for food, most gardeners will just consider these an annual and plant something else in its place next year, not saving the roots for the following year. Some of our native butterflies in the United States can use these as a host plant for their babies, for their caterpillars. So if you plant these, especially in your pollinator garden, instead of in your food garden, you might get swallowtail caterpillars and get more butterflies in your garden. And if you let dill and parsley flower, the pollinators love those flowers. Now, dill in particular likes to go to flower early. You can get flowers on your dill plants pretty quickly in summer, but if you do let them go to flower, they will feed pollinators. But dill in particular will self-sow, meaning when you let it go to flower, those flowers are likely to turn into seeds, and then if those seeds may spread a little bit out from the area where you planted it, and you'll get new dill plants later. And so again, just like I've talked about a couple times, depending on where you live, that may or may not be a problem, but it's something to be aware of. I do want to give you one growing tip if you're doing parsley. I personally love to grow parsley just because I love to cook with it so much, and I also just think it's a beautiful plant. It has this nice sort of dark green color of the leaves. So most of these plants are easy to grow from seed. Parsley's easy to grow from seed, but parsley is one of those herbs that you just want to be careful if you're transplanting it because it grows this really long taproot. Growing it in a container, you want a container that's a little deeper, a little more tall than it is wide. I'm going to talk about cilantro next because whenever I think of parsley, I also think of cilantro because if you've ever noticed, if you've grown them or you go to the store, they look really similar. Their leaves look really similar. I had a grocery delivery once where I ordered some parsley and chopped up all this parsley to put in my food and somehow didn't notice that it smelled a little different and it was cilantro. And it wasn't the kind of dish where that's a good substitution. But parsley and cilantro, even though their leaves look similar, they actually grow very differently. So the thing with cilantro is more of an annual plant. Cilantro is really putting all of its energy above ground, and cilantro will bolt quickly. Bolt is sort of a gardener's term where it means something will flower faster than you want it to. I'm going to tell you a trick about growing cilantro if you want to and how to keep it from bolting too fast. But the thing about cilantro is because it will constantly be wanting to flower, it's one of these that can spread easily by its seed. Now, cilantro seeds are actually coriander. By the way, if you let your cilantro plant flower and then go to seed, those seeds you have are coriander. And if you've ever seen coriander or a cilantro seed, the seeds are a little bit larger. They're a little bigger and heavier. So unlike plants that have really tiny seeds that'll take off on the wind really well, cilantro won't go that far away, usually, from where you're planting it. But you will have a lot of seeds and it will reseed itself. So you want to be cautious about that. I do want to put in a growing tip here about cilantro. If you do want to grow cilantro, and particularly if you want to eat it, you don't want it to go to flower right away. The thing about cilantro is the cilantro plant needs full sun, almost as much sun as you can give it. That's what it wants. But cilantro will flower when the soil gets too hot. A high soil temperature is what causes cilantro to go to flower. So the trick to cilantro is if you can find a place for it in your yard or garden or on your patio or on your deck, in a place where the top of the plant can get full sun, but its container or its roots can be kept kind of cool, you'll be able to harvest cilantro leaves for a longer period of time. So that might mean having it in a container where you can kind of move it around your balcony or your patio, depending on, where the sun is shining, or kind of surround the pot, with other pots to sort of insulate it. Or if you're putting it in the ground, you want the cilantro plant to be able to get full sun, but maybe you can have a ground cover around it that's keeping its roots a little more cool. That's my number one tip on cilantro. I do want to mention basil here just because it's a very popular herb to grow, and similar to cilantro, it's really considered an annual where it's not developing much of a root system. It's putting most of its energy above ground. And a lot of times with basil, I grow basil because I love to cook with it. Basil is actually one of my favorite herbs to cook with in the summer. And the trick with basil is if you want to grow it to eat, you do want to be constantly pruning it so that it's not going to flower. Basil in particular, once it goes to flower, its leaves just aren't that good anymore. But similar to cilantro, basil will go to flower pretty quickly. With basil, it's more like if the plant is under any sort of stress. So it gets a little too hot, it gets a little too cold, whatever, it's going to start going to flower. Basil just doesn't really develop much of a root system at all. And so what's happening is the plant, if it gets any kind of stress at all, it's saying, oh, my time might be near, and so let me flower so that I can reproduce. So on the plus side though, if you want to put basil or cilantro in your pollinator garden for your pollinators, because when they flower, the pollinators will like it, these are cheap and easy to grow. You can plant basil and cilantro seeds, and within a week or two, you're going to have a plant. Within another couple of weeks, you're going to have a pretty big plant that you could start eating if you wanted. And then a couple weeks from that, if the weather is warm enough, you're going to start getting flowers. So it's sort of an easy, quick filler flower for a pollinator garden. Again, if you live in an area where you're not too worried about the seed spreading. I'm just going to talk about a couple more herbs in this episode today. One of them is sage. Some species of sage are native to the United States, but not all species of sage are considered culinary. And so when folks talk about growing sage in the garden as an herb to eat, they're talking about Salvia officinalis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which is not native to the United States. Sage is that herb that if you have a lot of traditional American stuffings on Thanksgiving, that really sort of overpowering flavor that folks associate with Thanksgiving stuffing, that's sage. That is Salvia officinalis. That is not the sage that is native to the United States. The non-native herb that is a culinary herb. This species of sage, even though it is not native in the United States, it is perennial in a lot of the United States. In gardening zones 4 through 10, it will come back year after year, and it usually flowers in the spring. You probably won't get flowers in the first year. You'll probably get flowers in the second year and every year thereafter. You can even see hummingbirds around sage flowers because it is a very high nectar flower. Also, the foliage of the plant, the leaves, are considered resistant in most parts of the country to deer and rabbits. So it can be helpful as maybe a border around an area where you want to keep some things out. Sage likes full sun and well-draining soil. Now, I live in Maryland where we have really humid summers and where our soil is really sort of compact, heavy, clay-like. I am able to grow sage in my yard, but for me, sage does better in a container where I can put in a really well-draining potting mix in it. And you can harvest a sage plant 2 or 3 times a year. Now, just like with a lot of other perennial plants, if you want that plant to come back next year, you don't want to harvest it right up to your first frost date. You want to give the plant a little bit of time. You want to have some leaves that stay on there through sort of late summer and into fall because those leaves will be feeding the underground roots. So if you do that, you let its leaves just be, leave it alone, let it sort of do its thing, naturally die back in the fall, then you'll probably get flowers next spring. But again, just like any plant that's not native where you are, you do want to look up the status in your state to see whether you do want to let it go to the next year and let it go to flower next year. And then I've saved what I think is the best one for last, chives. So chives is considered native in a lot of the northernmost part of the country. States including Washington State, Idaho, Montana over on the West Coast, in the Northeast, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and in some areas right around the Great Lakes. Now, interestingly with chives, in spite of its native status, it has been deemed a noxious weed in some parts of Indiana and in some parts of Massachusetts. Likely this is due to its naturally aggressive growing habit. So when chives is in a climate that it likes, it will spread. It grows a little bulb underground. So you plant a chive seed and it starts growing roots, but then over time it grows a little bulb, and over time those bulbs will kind of get bigger and spread. If chives is planted in the ground, they're going to spread readily. So in those two states, Indiana and Massachusetts, which are the two that have deemed this a noxious weed in some parts of those states, probably it interferes with grazing, like grazing cattle or other animals. It may interfere with big agriculture as well. Now, I don't live in one of those states, but I only plant my chives in containers or in my raised bed. And the reason for that is because I just don't want chives sort of taking over my whole yard, since it can be an aggressive grower, and chives grow really well in containers and in a small space. So it's one of those plants that's sort of good to keep it contained. Why bother growing chives? Okay, chives is perennial, anywhere in zones 3 through 9, so that's a lot of the United States. So almost anywhere you are in the country, you plant those chive seeds once, and they'll keep coming back year after year. And here's a really cool thing about chives. So when we think of chives usually associated with cooking, we're thinking of the chive leaves. It's like this long stalk, sort of, this long leafy part that sticks straight up from the ground, and you harvest that and you chop it up and you put it in your food. But if you let chives stay in the ground over winter, and if it likes where you've placed it and it comes back again next spring, starting in that second year, you're going to get flowers. And chive flowers are just adorable. So you've got that chive stalk sticking straight up, and there's usually a clump of chive stalks, all together. And on top of each of the chive stalks, you've got one adorable purple flower. And I would say the flowers are sort of like the size of a quarter around, but then they're like perfectly round. So it's like this little ball of flowers. And then when you look closely at it, each of those round balls is actually made up of a whole bunch of little flowers. And they are usually this gorgeous sort of pale purple color. And the flowers are also edible. The entire plant is edible. So you've got a fully edible plant that can season your food, that'll come back year after year. It's got these adorable purple puffy flowers that start usually in year 2. And so if you're in its native range, way up in the northern part of the country, it's well suited to your environment. It's going to be helpful to biodiversity, and it grows really well in containers. So how do you grow it? Chives is really easy to grow, super easy to grow from seeds. No point really in buying a chive plant, just buy the seeds. The seeds will germinate in about 2 weeks, as long as the soil temperature is between 60 and 70 degrees. Not the air temperature, but the soil temperature needs to be at that temperature, so it does like it to be warm. The seeds will germinate. You're going to see those little chive sprouts come up within a couple of weeks. And then a couple weeks from there, you'll be able to start harvesting it if you want to. To harvest your chive leaves, you want to wait until they're about 6 inches tall. And you don't want to wait too long because they are more flavorful when they're young and tender. So you can start harvesting them around 6 inches tall, or anywhere between sort of 6 and 12 inches tall. And you can harvest it one of 2 ways. You can just continually take a few leaves at a time, like cut the outer leaves off about 1 inch above the soil line, or twice a year, you can just take the entire plant. So when your plant gets to be about 1 foot tall, you can just sort of shear it off at the ground, and it will grow back. So if you do that, early in the summer, you cut it off, you can harvest it again in a few weeks. If you want it to come back next year, you do want to let that last set of leaves die back naturally. So when you get to late summer or early fall, depending on where you are, for me, once I get to around late August, I usually stop harvesting my chives and just let them die back naturally. And in terms of how chives can help you in your garden with a pollinator garden, there's a couple ways. Number one, some pollinators do like those flowers. So in early spring, starting in your second year, when you see those flowers, you might see some pollinators that are looking for a little early food come and visit it. The second way that you can think about chives helping you in your pollinator garden is because chives is a species of allium, which is the onion family, chives can also act as a little bit of a bug repellent. So while some pollinators may be attracted to the flowers in early spring, there are also a lot of bugs that don't like chives. So chives can be something that if you put them near some of your other plants that you don't want bugs to be interested in, it can be helpful. So how do you grow them? We've already talked about the seeds. Chives prefer full sun. 6 hours or more is ideal. Now, chives can do okay with a little bit less sun or sort of a dappled sun shade situation. I live in Maryland where we get pretty hot, humid summers. Mine are in about 4 to 6 hours of direct sun a day during the summer, and then the rest is more of a dappled light where the light's coming through tree leaves. Chives like a moist, well-draining soil. And what we mean by that is, say you've got chives in a container. When you water that container, you want to see the water come straight through the bottom. You want holes at the bottom of your container, and you don't want the water to kind of get stuck in that container where it's not draining out. You want to see it draining within a few minutes of when you water it. I mentioned earlier that chives develop a bulb underground. Those kind of bulbs are particularly susceptible to what's called root rot, where they'll actually rot away, which will do in the plant if they are sitting in too much really soggy, wet soil for too long. So chives do like to be in moist soil where you're not fully letting it dry out. You're checking it regularly and giving it a little water if it needs it, but it probably wouldn't be a good option for a rain garden where it's just sitting in a pool of water. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bees and Reverie Radio. You can find us almost anywhere that you like to get your podcasts. You can also find us on many social media sites like Blue Sky and a lot of the other usual places at Bees and Reverie Radio. If you've got any feedback for us or there's something that you want to hear more of or less of, let us know on one of our social media accounts.